Now, you're the expert in resilient employees. In your opinion, why are resilient employees essential to business success?
Look, resilience actually, when people are resilient, they cope better with change. So that's one thing. And change is constant in business. We know that. So, there's change coming around the corner at us all the time. So resilient people cope better with change. They manage their emotions more effectively. So they can, process what's going on for them and continue to move through even when times are tough. So they don't give up as easily. So you find they're more productive, they're more flexible, they're producing more, they're interacting with clients better, they're managing client relationships more effectively and so on. So there's a huge benefit to having them in business because essentially they do business better. They do life better as well, but business better is the thing that, if you're a business owner, you're mainly concerned with.
Mm. A lot of people have their head in the sand, or they got their head in the book, or they got their head in the department, and they may not be aware of the changes, or they may not be able to articulate the change. What are some of the changes that are very common in the workplace at the moment? And maybe even some examples since COVID. What are these changes that are taking place?
If we go back to COVID, we had a huge fundamental shift to the way that we work. A lot of my clients weren't prepared for it. We saw a lot of organisations sending people home without basic equipment because they didn't have laptops and webcams and things like that. That was a really big shift. We saw people struggling to cope with the isolation of being at home. Lots of people didn't have the space or the ability to set up effectively in the home environment. And now we're actually seeing the opposite happening, where people are being encouraged back into the workplace and they don't want to go. So there's some big changes there. We're certainly seeing a lot of focus at the moment in Tasmania anyway on leaning businesses out. So we're seeing a lot of redundancies happening. There's big changes happening in terms of the way that we do business. AI is going to be an absolute game changer if it hasn't already started for a lot of people. So there's constant change. I haven't met a business in the last 10 years that isn't going through some sort of upheaval or change. Whether it's a change of management, it's a downsizing, growth, upsizing can be a big change for people as well. Change to jobs, change to position descriptions, moving locations, working at home, working in the workplace. There's a lot of change going on.
And are leaders sitting down with their team members to talk about the changes that are coming? Or is it just like a surprise party? Hey, surprise, we've got change today. Enjoy. What's happening out there in the workforce?
Look, it depends. Some people are doing it really well, and I have come across businesses that are working really effectively in the change space and they're engaging change managers to help them. Some businesses, like you said, are just going, surprise, we're making everyone redundant today.
Boom.
Yeah, and look, probably one of the worst examples of that I saw was it was a few years ago now, and I was running a program, and the business said to me, look, we've got an announcement to make, so we want you to take a longer morning tea than what's on the agenda. And I said, look, no problem at all. They all left the room, and I had about 40 people, I think, in that program, and they came back in after about 40 minutes or so, and they just looked shell-shocked. Obviously something had happened to them. So I said, what's happening? What went on for you? And they told me they all got called into a meeting room, so it was the whole business into this meeting room. And they said, we're going to put the org chart up, the new org chart. We're restructuring. There's going to be a new org chart appear on the wall. And if you see your name, you're fine. If your name's not there, then HR will be booking an appointment with you in the next 2 weeks to talk about your options. And then, ta-da, here's the org chart. It was just gobsmackingly bad.
Sounds like Hunger Games.
Yeah. Yeah, it was a bit like that. It's like, we're going to line you all up and, on the left or turn right, or everyone who still works for this organisation, take one step forward. Not so fast.
In my mind, that is not an emotionally intelligent approach from a leadership perspective. So from a leader's perspective, when they lack that emotional intelligence and they make these mass announcements in a group, what emotions are triggered and what are the moods that the employees get into as a result of those announcements?
The very first thing that gets triggered for everybody is a threat response. So something's attacking us, something's not safe. And look, it's very primal. It goes back to our very early wiring as human beings, where we really can't tell the difference from a brain or emotional perspective between being attacked by a bear or having an announcement that we're restructuring the business. So people go into threat response. What I saw that day was a range of emotions. The people who were safe and actually had jobs were struggling with feeling terribly guilty about it. It's like I'm relieved, but at the same time I feel terrible for my colleagues, and I feel incredibly guilty that, why me and not them. People who didn't see their name on the org chart were, they were shocked, they were disappointed, they were upset, they were angry, they were in denial. There was a whole range of emotions that go on when you make a big announcement like that. But essentially it comes from the space of people no longer feel safe. So denial is really common at the beginning. This isn't happening to me, or there must be a mistake. My name should be there and they've missed it somehow, and any minute they're going to come into the room and tell me that it's fine. People get angry. Anger is a really common emotion with that kind of announcement. People get furious about it. It's like, how dare they do that to us? People get really sad, depressed. You get that, tears, you get overwhelm. It's a really big challenge. It really kind of hits the heart of who we are as humans. So you see these enormous emotions come out during those times.
Mm. And I can just imagine that in my mind, that the head's in the sand, they're in denial, then they pull their head out and realise, hey, this is happening. And they get angry, but the anger turns into sadness and depression, and now they're down in that pit of despair. The emotionally intelligent leader, how are they counselling or consoling their people once they get into that pit of despair?
You've got to really pay attention to everybody as an individual, because quite often I see the team get lumped together as a group and we just deal with, we assume everyone's moving along at the same pace, and people just don't. So it's got to be very personal, and you've got to be there, you've got to be supporting people. And something I do see is leaders disappearing during a change process because it's too uncomfortable. So I don't want to talk to people in case they ask me a question I can't answer, or in case they cry, or in case they get upset or angry. And again, look, I had I was going to say a wonderful example, but it's not. It's an example of what not to do. When I was actually running a Thriving in Change program for an organisation, and we got to morning tea when everyone turns their phone back on, and this woman in the front row who obviously got upsetting text messages because she leapt up and rushed out of the room. Now, she didn't come back after the morning tea finished, so I just asked someone sitting with her if they could go and check and see how she was going. And they went out and came back and said, look, she's not coming back today. And, that was it. The woman who'd left the room emailed me the next day and said that her manager had sent her a text message to tell her she'd been made redundant. And the rationale was because she was in a Thriving in Change program, that was the best time to send it because she'd feel supported. Which is...
Perfect example of what not to do.
Yeah, you've got to be present for people. You've got to be there to support them and hear the uncomfortable emotions because they're there. And like I said, managers ignore them or walk away from them or hide from them because they think it's going to be too uncomfortable for them. But the reality is you've got to almost walk with people through that process. You've got to accept that people will be angry, and that's okay, and give them space to talk about what that feels like for them. And they are going to get sad. And the key thing is not to make big decisions about life when you're in those negative emotional spaces, because I have seen people make some big decisions that they regretted afterwards because they weren't processing effectively. And managers, like I said, some are really, really good at this. I've met some managers that are brilliant at supporting people and, being with them through those emotional spaces, and others who just can't cope with it at all.
One of our cultures in Australia is that culture of she'll be right, mate.
Yep.
And we think that just by saying you'll be right, mate, it's going to fix everything. But some employees are more resilient than others, and some have less flexibility. So if I'm a leader and I'm looking at my team, what type of skills and characteristics would I be looking out for to be able to identify a resilient employee?
Essentially what you're looking for is people who process emotion effectively, because that's what it's about. It's about the ability to bounce back from things that come along. So people who have a generally optimistic attitude to life, people who have good social support, that's important for people, that sort of optimism, that ability to think ahead, to be adaptable to things. We find that confidence is a really big part of it, because resilient people are confident they've got the skills to get through. It's like, yes, this is coming at me and it's going to be really hard, but I know that I'm capable and I make good decisions and I can work this out. And if I give you an example of a redundancy situation, again, because it's, on the radar a lot at the moment, a resilient employee goes, well, this is awful. Being made redundant is a terrible thing for me, but I know I've got good skills and I'm going to be marketable. So I'm going to dust off my resume. I'm going to go and see somebody about it. I'm going to register with recruiters. I'm going to put my name out there. I'll start having coffees with all the relevant people that I know, talk to my network, and I'll start working towards another job now. Whereas somebody with less resilience is going to probably stay stuck in that cycle of, anger, denial, sadness, and people can bounce around in that and they'll get stuck in it for a long time. I heard a story just a couple of days ago about someone who'd been made redundant about 3 months ago and is just stuck in the sadness space. He's paralysed, he can't move forward. He hasn't even started applying for jobs. And his fear now is that his redundancy money is going to start to run out. And he's looking at mortgages and kids in school and things like that. And he's just getting more and more distressed about it, which is just awful to see.
That really makes sense because you mentioned before the survival instinct. The money's running out, the water rates are coming in, they're getting higher, the electricity bills are coming in, they're getting higher, the kids are getting older, the shoes, I don't know if you've got kids, but my kids seem to be buying shoes every single month. They buy more of them. And those bills just keep coming in like the waves. And that causes a lot of stress. We also understand that a lot of financial pressure leads to relationship breakdowns inside the home. So there must be so much pressure there for people. Now, if those people do leave the job or they are made redundant and they do have a lower level of resiliency, what happens when you mix that low level of resiliency into a culture that's been built so there's high levels of resiliency? What happens as you blend the resilient employees with the inflexible ones?
It's one of those things that when you've got a really highly resilient culture or people in your organisation who are very resilient, it's not a very attractive proposition for people who aren't. So you tend to find with culture, when people start in an organisation, it doesn't take them very long to figure out whether they're going to be a good fit or not. And people who are not a good fit will often opt out. But interestingly enough, it's resilient people who will opt out if they're not a good fit. People who aren't resilient will stay and become more uncomfortable. And so you get, like I said, resilient people are capable. They know they've got skills. They are employable. They can get out there and find another job. So they'll often opt out when they don't fit into the culture. But what you get is you often get, and I see this quite a lot, is teams that are moving ahead, they're adapting to change, they're even creating change themselves, they're creating new products, new services, they're out there getting things done. And the people who are stuck in that sort of inflexible struggle space find it very difficult to keep up with that. And so they often get performance managed out of businesses that are very resilient as well, which is really sad because it's almost like their worst fears come to pass because of the fact that they're being so passive about that the space that they're in. Now, this is not their fault. It's one of the things about it is that life happens to people. There's lots of things that happen in people's lives that can really chip away at their natural resilience. So you end up with this space where someone starts a new job. Just say they've been made redundant. They're not happy. Maybe they don't get another job for 3 or 4 months. They get all those stresses. And then they find a new job. It's going to be quite difficult for them to bounce back to the level of resilience they were before. It's kind of like a gradual creep-up process. So you do get these organisations where you do get the resilient people versus the not resilient people, the constructive people versus the defensive people. And the constructive people power ahead and get things done, and the defensive people become more defensive because they feel that they're not fitting in. And the more the business moves without them, the bigger that gap is between, me feeling like I fit into this culture and the fact that I don't. So it's pretty challenging. And you do see, like I said, businesses that are predominantly constructive cultures will move those people on fairly quickly. They'll recognise that it hasn't been a good hire.
With resiliency, if I build resiliency in my personal life, let's say, for example, I've gone through learning disabilities. I'm asking for a friend, by the way. I've gone through learning disabilities. I've had health challenges, and I've built resiliency in that area of my life, my personal life. Is that a transferable set of skills into my professional life, or do I have to relearn resiliency?
No, it's absolutely something that once you have it, it's with you. I mean, it's like a muscle. EI and resiliency is like a muscle. You've got to use it or lose it kind of thing. But resilience in your personal life absolutely transfers into the professional environment because, like I said, it's being confident, being adaptable, knowing that you've got skills, having a good social support network around you. There's a number of things that can help support that. But, it carries into every area of somebody's life.
I remember when I was about 17 or 18, I was a lot better looking than I am now. And my cousin said, you need to build wit and charm. You need to become confident.
Great advice.
And I heard that and I thought, well, how do I do that? And he said, well, go to a restaurant one night and get a table for one and sit there by yourself and talk to the hostess, talk to the waitress and start a conversation. And I got out of the comfort zone and I did that. And then what I found was that in business, when I went and knocked on somebody's door, I had this sort of spark up a conversation. If I went to a networking event, I could show up by myself. When I started to travel overseas, I could go and stay at a hostel and share any room and have a conversation with anyone. And I also found that that skill of confidence and the ability to talk to anybody and not fear the rejection carried through. And like a muscle, it's definitely got stronger over time. It just didn't appear. There was no pill, there was no injection to get it.
Yeah.
It was something that I had to work on. And I do believe that, absolutely. It's like a muscle. So with emotional intelligence and resiliency being a key factor of emotional intelligence, what are some simple ways that business leaders, managers, and even teams, what are some ways that they can develop better or even higher levels of emotional intelligence?
There's 4 key factors in emotional intelligence according to the original Mayer and Salovey model. The first one is being able to recognise emotion, and that's, in an interaction with somebody, you can see by looking at them that something's maybe not quite right, or there's they're telling you something verbally, but their body language doesn't match it. And it's also about recognising your own emotions, and that's pretty easy to develop. We're actually very good at it as a species. We've just forgotten how to look. And I find that when you start to pay attention to it and start to look at the whole person, it can develop fairly quickly with people. Then there's the ability to use emotion, which is about how do I use my emotional state to help me in what I've got to do today. So a really good example is when you sit down to do something, and we've all done it, gone, I'm so not in the mood for this right now. And then you've got some choices. You can plough ahead and do it anyway, or you can change your emotional state to match the task, which is if you've got to do something really detailed, maybe you've got to do a spreadsheet and you've got to work on a budget and you're kind of feeling quite upbeat because you've just been to the gym, you've just had a really great time with your family, you've had breakfast, you're feeling kind of, upbeat, and you sit down at your desk and go, oh God, budgets, you could, what we know about that is if you're in a very upbeat mood, you're not likely to track for details, so you're going to make mistakes. So you've actually got to wait till you're in a more neutral mood or bring your mood down to suit that space. And likewise, if you've got to do something strategic and creative, being in a bad mood isn't going to help that at all. And in fact, you can then change your mood. And anyone who's used a playlist at the gym to motivate themselves when they're on the treadmill, that's what you're doing. You're changing your emotional state by using some sort of external thing like music or, whatever it is. There's a lot of things that you can use, but it's how do I change my state? Then there's about understanding emotion, which is understanding how emotion works and the fact that it's, emotions change over time. They're not static. Emotions pass. If you're upset about something, it goes away. In time. In fact, emotions pass after about 90 seconds if you don't grab onto them and kind of, pull it in and make it part of who you are. So paying more attention to the people around you. And if somebody's upset about something, actually probably a story is the best way to illustrate this. I had a client who said to me when I went to see her one day, oh my God, my best person just resigned and I had no idea it was coming. And I said, really? You had no idea? And she said, oh, well, yeah, 6 months ago he told me he wasn't happy. It's like, that was the clue. The fact that she hadn't paid attention to the fact that by not fixing the problem, his emotions escalated over time to the point where he quit. So paying more attention to that, we know that if somebody's unhappy and we don't fix it for them, we don't fix the thing that's making them unhappy at work, the emotion will escalate. It's not going to stay static. And likewise, if somebody's really angry about something and you remove the stimulus, they don't go from anger to nothing in 0 time. It takes time to ramp down. And then the final part of it is managing emotion, which is about it's not about flatlining emotion and not having emotion at all. That's not the goal. It's about navigating your emotion effectively. It's about, processing something. So say, for example, you find yourself feeling really irritated about something. You don't have to act on it. You can go, isn't it interesting that I'm feeling irritated about this? So managing emotion is like an internal conversation you have with yourself where you recognise the emotion. You go, okay, I'm feeling angry, but you don't have to do anything with it. And it's about making strategic choices. Now, the strategic choice might still be to demonstrate that anger because there is righteous anger, the right anger at the right time, at the right place with the right people. That's perfectly okay, but it's about being strategic about what you do as a result of emotion because we don't have to act on them. We've almost been conditioned to think that once we experience an emotion, we have to do something with it. We actually don't. You can just, like I said, 90 seconds later, it'll just disappear if you let it go. So there's a few things that you can do, but essentially that's, practice it is the most important thing, because we're naturally very good at EI. We've just forgotten how to do it. Because in Western society, we don't value it, we don't talk about it, we don't process it. And there are lots of cultures that do. Lots of cultures that process emotion really effectively, and kids are taught from a really young age to experience all of their emotions, and they're all okay. And in Western society, we're taught, boys don't cry, that kind of thing, which is terrible.
Keep a step up a lift.
Yeah, exactly.
You don't want to show any signs of weakness.
Yeah, exactly. So it's, like I said, it's about just paying attention to the emotion and going, rather than saying, I am angry, because that fuses you with the emotion, say, isn't it interesting that I'm feeling angry? And then the emotion tones itself down as you almost disconnect from it. And it's not saying you want the emotion to go away, because then you go, I wonder what that anger's about. Like, what is it about this situation that's so triggering for me? Why is it making me angry? And then what am I going to choose to do as a result of this? Because you've got strategic choices to make.
And everybody is at choice. They're your emotions, and you get to decide what you want to do with them, ultimately.
Exactly, yeah.
You can use them to help you. And I think in sales, one of the things that I learned was I was always told, Daniel, you're too aggressive. You're too competitive. And I'd scratch my head and think, I'm a state champion athlete. I'm an Australian champion athlete. Wouldn't have those traits and characteristics and the aggression and the competitiveness drive me to success? In my mind, that was my reality. Hey, it helped me get there. When I got into business, people would say, you're too aggressive, too competitive. And I think, I'm a real estate agent. I'm selling. Shouldn't I be competitive? Aren't there other lions out there chasing the same prey, and they're all trying to jump on them at a cheaper price? Don't I have to be aggressive? And I think we've got to be aware of that. When do they help us, and also when they hurt us?
Exactly.
In your opinion, from my perspective, is people often correlate a high IQ with success. And oftentimes they say you've got to have a high level of emotional intelligence to be successful. But from your perspective, is there times that having a lower level of emotional intelligence could be an advantage to you?
That's a great question. It's something that I haven't been asked before. Thinking on it, I can't see a situation where that would be the case, because it's so incredibly valuable in helping us navigate the world and navigate relationships with other people. And even, when you're on your own without other people, what am I feeling about this? I can't see a situation where it would be helpful to have low EI, but I'm open to debate on that one. If somebody's got an example, I'd be happy to talk about it, but off the cuff, I can't think of one.
Many years ago, I was working with a business, and they would buy businesses in distress. And one of the roles of the manager was to walk into the business and fire 200 or 300 people at one time. And the owner of the business said that this manager could walk in and fire 200 or 300 people and lose no sleep. And he said it's the most fantastic trait. He has no empathy. And I thought to myself, I said, that's fascinating, because having a lower level of empathy enabled him to do his job very effectively and go home and not lose any sleep and have no stress about it. But on the flip side, when the business did the turnaround and they went back into the growth phase, that lower level of empathy prevented him from building a new team. So on one side of the coin, it really helped him fire people effectively and save the business. And then the other side is, once they reinvented the business model, he couldn't bring teams together.
Yeah.
So the business owner looked at this and he said, this is an unusual strength to have. So he positioned him in part of his business that only when they purchased a company would they send him in to do all the firing. But when it came to do the hiring, they left him out of it and they brought somebody else in. And that's one of the things that I've seen in the past, that it can be advantageous. Another example that I've seen is that people with a really high level of empathy, especially if we're measuring it, if they start to get over 85 or 90 points, the empathy almost turns into sympathy. And when they're in the role of selling, they start to hear these objections from their customers. I don't have enough time. My mother's sick. My children's sick. My job's on the line. And they take on all of that. And instead of being empathetic and reading their emotional makeup, they become sympathetic and they start to experience and take on the emotion. and they think to themselves, gee whiz, I wouldn't want to be closed on. I wouldn't want to be asked to buy if I was going through that. And they stop selling. But anybody who seems to be below that seems to hear the objection, display empathy, and say, hey, I understand how you're thinking and feeling, and this is the solution that you need. And they keep overcoming those obstacles. So I've seen that in my experience.
Yeah, and look, empathy is a component of emotional intelligence, but it's not everything about emotional intelligence. So you can be very empathetic, and with a high level of emotional intelligence, that empathy doesn't need to translate into what you were saying. So I'm going to go back to your example of the guy with no empathy at all. And my concern with somebody like that would be that in his firing of people, yes, he's doing a great job for the business, but the damage that he's doing to those individuals as he sees them out the door. You know, somebody with empathy can still fire somebody, but do it in a way that feels like I've had people say to me after they've been fired by somebody with a high level of empathy, that was dreadful, but I can't fault the way that it was done. I felt supported, I felt cared for, I felt valued. I've walked out of here with my self-esteem intact. And that's what we're aiming for. Somebody without empathy, my real concern in that would be that they were damaging people on the way out the door. And, you know, it's an awful thing to contemplate, but I have known of people in redundancy situations having been made redundant who've then taken their own life. And we would never want to be in a situation where we could look at that and go, our business may have contributed to that by the way that that was handled. And I know I've gone to a pretty dark place here, but it's, you know, something that's been quite topical. So somebody with empathy can still fire somebody, but they will do it in a way where the person still feels their self-esteem's intact at the end of it. That's what I'm getting at. And likewise with people who've got too high, and you say too high in empathy, and then they're resonating too much with the customer and then failing to do their job. That again is a lack of emotional intelligence because they're letting the emotion overwhelm them. They're not managing emotion. So managing emotion is feeling that emotion and going, I'm just feeling this incredible level of empathy for this customer and the space that they're in right now. But it doesn't then have to drive my behaviour. Do you see the difference?
I do. There's a movie called Up in the Air with George Clooney. Have you seen this one?
Yes.
And his role is to help people transition after they've been fired. And they changed the way that they were doing the firing in the business. They went from doing it face-to-face to doing it via video. And even his job became redundant at some period. But he was very good with his level of emotional intelligence, is that he could take a person who was distressed, preserve their dignity, and help them move on to the next stage of their life. And I think if anybody has seen that movie and you reflect on it, George Clooney in that role has some great emotional intelligence, especially with that de-hiring process.
And that's what we want, is we want, you know, people are humans. You know, we call them human resources, but they're, you know, let's go back to the fact that they're humans. And if we do have to exit people from our businesses, it's a terrible thing to do to somebody. And we need to be able to do it in a way that that person feels supported and valued, not kicked out the door, which is often the way that people feel when something's happened to them like that. Because, you know, it's also about your employee brand as well. Like if you think about it, your employer brand in the market, if people have had a bad experience with you, when you go back to the growth period of having to hire people, it's what your ex-employees are saying about you in the market. You know, because if you're in a relatively smallish community, you know, I mean, we're looking at Hobart here as an example. We're not a massive community. Everybody knows everybody, or it feels like that way. You know, we've got 2 degrees of separation. And so people having a bad experience with an employer spreads pretty quickly through the market. And then people who are looking for, potentially if you're recruiting, they're looking at that job and they're saying, well, you know, my friend's neighbour had a terrible experience with that company on the way out the door. Is that somebody I'd really want to go and work for?
Interesting thought, isn't it? Got to be mindful of the way in and on the way out.
Yep.
Now, what problems would a business be facing to know that it's time to reach out to you?
We, at Shaping Change, we deal with a lot of things. Our portfolio is organisational development, which is pretty big. So we cover strategy, organisational culture, leadership development, team building, and so on. But the key thing I find about cultural issues is that businesses often don't know they've got them. What they're doing is they're dealing with problems, but they're dealing with problems that are as a result of a deeper cultural problem. So just say, and I'll give you an example. I had a client that brought me in because they said, in our business, we struggle to deliver. We're really, really good at taking on projects, but we're struggling to deliver them. Can you come in and help us figure out why that is? So I had a big meeting with all of their staff. So we had about 120 people in the room. And as we were working through what's actually going on for them, one of the people actually piped up at some point with this amazing observation and said, The problem is that we all say yes when we have no intention of ever doing anything. So if you come to me, Daniel, and you say, hey, Ros, can you do a thing? And I'll go, yep, sure, no worries at all, I've got that. And you come back and you see me a month later and you say, how were you going with the project? And I'll go, you know what, I just got really busy and I had other priorities and this thing came in. And you say to me, that's all right. You know, next month is fine. And so we have this dialogue that goes on in the organisation where nobody's being held accountable. And that was the real issue. It wasn't about them, you know, taking things on and not delivering. The real issue was the lack of accountability. And the cultural issue there was that they all felt so, it's almost like they described themselves as a family, which is like a big happy family. But they didn't hold anyone accountable. And it was a very approval-based culture, which is that I don't do anything or say anything or make any decisions that might upset you. So I don't hold you to account. So if I haven't done the thing you've asked me to do, there's no consequence. And you just say to me, that's okay. You know, next month's fine. And that was the cultural issue in their organisation. So the problem they came to me with was we're not delivering anything. What's actually really going on? We're letting customers down. The cultural issue was this issue of, you know, approval. We all need to be liked. And that was what we had to deal with.
You're also the author of the book, The Resilient Employee. What's the essence of your book? What's the message? And where can we find a copy of the book?
Look, the book is, I wrote it originally because it came from a program I run called Thriving in Change, which I was running a lot in organisations. And people gave me the most amazing feedback about it. It was one of those things where it's like, I had no idea that this is how change worked for me. So it's targeted at employees who are going through a change process. And the thought behind the book was to get the message out to a wider audience. So, it's basically about how we cope with change, the emotional responses to change, normalising the change process so that people don't feel so alone. It's that sense of, I get it now, other people feel the same way about this, and giving them tips and strategies to be more resilient moving forward. It's available on Amazon, and in any of the bookstores. Actually, had it suggested to me recently on Pinterest, which was quite surprising. When I was scrolling Pinterest, said, you might like this book. And it's available in Walmart in the US as well. So any of the big major booksellers have it, Amazon, online, and so on.